Hello, Krzysztof the Polish Geek, and I'm back with another movie review, and I'm going to review The Lord of the Rings, War of the Rohirrim, because, yes, I managed to see this movie for early screening, and I have to say, it was not particularly great. I was actually kinda looking forward to it, at least at first, when first was announced and I saw some of the art forms, yeah, at that point I was looking forward to it, and then once I was starting hearing all the news about Hera and all, I started having strong doubts about it. But yes, it was not particularly great. I mean, it's not offensively bad like the Rings of Plagiarism, and it certainly doesn't directly contradict the lore in contrast to Rings of Power, because, I mean, it does have plenty of indirect contradictions, but it certainly doesn't contradict the lore directly in contrast to the Rings of Prime, but again, it was not particularly good. I say it was pretty mediocre. I guess normies will love it, I guess, but at the end of the day, it seems like in the modern day, just one of those perfect examples when people might mistake mediocrity for greatness. And I love Tolkien, and I love Middle-earth, and I think J.R. Tolkien is by far the greatest storyteller and world builder that has ever lived. And the Lord of the Rings trilogy by Peter Jackson are my most beloved movies ever, and nothing is ever gonna change that. And it was actually one of my first you should be watching videos. It's actually in the video description, but again, I couldn't help but find this pretty mediocre. Like, I mean, this is also sad because I also really love anime, and the animation here was actually pretty beautiful, but then again, I actually stayed for the credits and I realized that outside of animation, this is very much a Western production. Yes, the Japanese were only responsible for the animation, nothing else. Like the script, the writing, like the whole story, everything is very much made by the Western studio. And honestly, I'm not surprised. And I will have to say, there were some individual good moments here, we'll get to them later, and unlike most people, I actually tried to go with an open mind and not to dismiss the whole thing right away. But at the end of the day, again, beautiful animation, and I did like few things, but at the end of the day, it was pretty mediocre at best. And another thing, I'm also not very fond of the idea of turning Middle-earth and Tolkien into another mega franchise in the style of Marvel and Star Wars, even though sadly it seems like this might be happening because I consider Tolkien's works as sacred and not to be used lightly. And so now on to the movie. First, there were some positives, as I already said. The animation admittedly is pretty beautiful and gorgeous, and it was really amazing to look at, and admittedly I already knew that from the trailer. So yes, the animation and art were beautiful, and I really do hope that maybe that's the animation that will be used for Berserk anime adaptation, if it ever gets one in the first place, even though it truly deserves. Like, the closest thing we got to a great Berserk anime is the 1997 Berserk, but sadly that was very much discontinued and it only adapted the Golden Age arc, even though the story gets much better later, and even then it still left out a lot of amazing things from the manga. But yes, I will have to say it, Berserk truly needs an amazing anime adaptation. Truly, we need some passionate people that care for Berserk and give it a true anime adaptation from beginning to end with all the details in that truly does Berserk justice. But again, we're going on a tangent. Back to War of the Rohirrim. War of the Rohirrim was certainly also very huge on nostalgia bait, and yeah, because the Rohan was decidedly the same Rohan that we very much seen in the Peter Jackson films. I mean, I guess it justifies since it does technically take place in the same continuity as the Peter Jackson films, and also the music, the Rohan theme is also very much frequently used in this movie, and some of the scenes feel like outright copies from scenes from the movies. So yes, when it comes to baiting nostalgia, this movie was very huge on that, which still didn't stop me from sometimes forgetting that I was watching a movie set in Middle-earth. Like literally halfway through the movie, I actually even forgot I was watching a movie set in Middle-earth, despite the fact that I very much knew well this movie was coming and what I was going to watch and all the nostalgia bait constantly. And it literally felt like halfway through the movie like I was just watching some random fantasy anime movie. I mean, if you call it anime, since it's technically Western production, with Japanese only being responsible for the animation. So I guess it is an anime, but still, yep. I just felt like I was watching a random generic fantasy movie with original characters. And honestly, if that's what it was, it would actually somewhat elevate the movie for me. Because as I said, Tolkien's works I consider sacred and not to be used lightly. As I actually went out of the theater, I actually had a pretty interesting discussion with a group of people who were in the theater with me, and they actually made a pretty decent point that the story of Helm Hammerhand in the Tolkien's appendices is actually described pretty broadly, like, as you know, as history, kind of as a lore, as history, and not much details is given, and the movie doesn't actually directly, at least, contradict any of the details. It just basically expands on the story with so much details. So, as long as it doesn't contradict those appendices, then it's okay. And it is a pretty decent point, but I can't agree with that, because Hera was only mentioned once as Helm Hammerhand's daughter, and that's it. Like, not even her name was given. Like, clearly, Tolkien only wrote about her once and just described her as daughter of Helm Hammerhand, so clearly he very much did not consider her as really that integral to the story. And not only that, but again, if she was just maybe like a supporting character and was very heavily involved in the story, that wouldn't be a problem, but the whole story is practically about her, and it's basically like all the credit goes to her, despite the fact that the Tolkien's appendices very much give it to Helm Hammerhand, to his two sons, to Hera's cousin. Actually, like for example, defeating the main villain Wolf, that should very much go to Fitlaf, Hera's cousin, not her. Like, as I said, if Tolkien really considered her integral to the story, he would very much give us a lot more details about her, instead of just like mentioning her once without even giving her a name. I was also pretty shocked that Hera wasn't a Merisu. She was actually a somewhat decently written character, and as I said, if that was an entirely original story, completely unrelated to Middle-earth, I might actually even enjoy it, because, as I said, Hera was at times somewhat a decently written character, but it doesn't change the fact that there were still some cringy things, like her complete refusal to ever get married was pretty cringy, and that's certainly not something that Tolkien would ever write. And in general, it does feel like basically a whole backdoor way of rewriting Tolkien's story under the guise of just expanding on it. Like, let's use the Hobbit movies as the comparison. Say what you want about those movies and their changes, and there were plenty of changes, and people understandably weren't happy, but at the end of the day, you can't really say the story was rewritten. At worst, what you can say is that plenty of completely pointless and unneeded material was needed, but at the end of the day, the story is still very much heavily focused on Bilbo and Thorin. But well, on the other hand, the best comparison I think you can make is that imagine if the Hobbit movies like Kili and Toriel were basically the main characters and the whole story was practically about their romance, and then they basically took credit for every character's work. Like, for example, imagine if Toriel basically killed Smaug and then told the town that Bort did it, and yep, this is pretty much what it felt like. And well, Toriel was certainly not in the books, but at the end of the day, she didn't take over the story that wasn't hers. Well, Hera did. Again, if this was an entirely new, original fantasy story unrelated to Middle-earth, I might actually enjoy it. The problem is, they're just using a beloved IP so that more people will see the movie. And another thing about the another bad thing about the movie was the villain, because he wasn't compelling at all. Like, he was a regular human, and plenty of people saying that it will be actually pretty interesting to have a regular human this time as a villain in the Middle-earth story. And sure, I actually agree with that, except that Wolf wasn't interesting or compelling at all. Like, his motivation wasn't even clear exactly. Like, they're trying to make him sympathetic and evil at the same time, but you can't have one or the other. And even then, his motivation mostly seemed that he was mad that Hera rejected his marriage proposal, but... And as I said, there was all the Hera's adamant refusal to ever get married to any man was pretty cringy. Like, she rejected Wolf. That could be interesting, but maybe having her actually be in love with someone else and explain why she's so adamant about not wanting to marry Wolf, that would actually create for a far more interesting and compelling story. But as I said, just like her complete adamant to ever get married to anyone, that actually was pretty cringy and certainly not something that Tolkien would ever write. And also, as I already said before, despite huge and constant nostalgia baiting, halfway through the movie you actually even forget that you're watching a Lord of the Rings movie, or set in Middle-earth, whatever. At the end of the day, War of the Rohirrim is pretty forgettable and mediocre and best. I mean, normies will love it, I guess, but at the end of the day, I guess it's still much better than the Rings of Plagiarism, but that's not really that much of a high achievement, and Hera certainly is not as cringy as the Galadriel from the Rings of Power, but at the end of the day, as I already said, if this was a fantasy anime without any relation to Middle-earth, I guess I might enjoy the movie more, but as I said in the beginning, Tolkien's IP should not be used lightly. And I just think that they should just stop making any adaptation of Tolkien's works whatsoever. I mean, we have the magnificent books and all of Tolkien's appendices and all that, plus we have a best trilogy in the history of mankind, the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings trilogy, and I'm even one of those people that does find the Hobbit movies pretty underrated. I do actually like them, but at the end of the day, I think that's all we really need for Middle-earth. Like, Tolkien's IP is sacred and should not be used lightly. I mean, not that my words will mean anything, they obviously fall on deaf ears, and now it's obvious that Amazon and Warner Brothers very much is hell-bent on just like milking this IP to the ground, but I can here still express my thoughts on that. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for checking out this review, and press the like button. Please subscribe this channel, and I will talk to you soon in another video. Talk to you then, bye.